The forensic algorithmic system initiates a total spatial, temporal, and optical scan of the federal legislative hearing chamber. The operational baseline of the room is mathematically saturated with the residual atmospheric pressure of previous political storms, carefully staged acoustic outrage, and highly processed investigative procedures. The primary target, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, physically breaches the perimeter and navigates toward the witness coordinate. The optical sensors record her exact kinetic posture. She structurally carries her biological entity entirely like an operator who mathematically believes the spatial geometry of the room already strictly belongs to her. The system retrieves the target's verified historical data profile. Prior to this specific chronological marker, she had systematically navigated exactly 8 separate congressional inquiries. She had successfully logged exactly 11 chronological hours of continuous physical testimony. She had structurally absorbed years of broadcast headlines, processed thousands of incoming alphanumeric queries, and systematically deployed acoustic phrases that had been meticulously polished by legal operators until every single sharp forensic edge had been mechanically sanded down to a frictionless surface. Throughout the entirety of this operational history, she had mathematically always engineered a viable extraction vector, consistently leaving the witness table in a fully vertical, standing posture. The forensic algorithm catalogs the specific unresolved data nodes that have continuously tracked her operational trajectory exactly like physical smoke. The deleted server emails, the unauthorized private hardware architecture, the Benghazi kinetic event, the grieving biological mothers, the flag-draped coffins, and the initial video explanation. The system calculates that the accumulated smoke had mathematically never generated sufficient structural density to successfully halt her operational momentum. That specific narrative of absolute survival was the exact structural baseline she projected when she physically lowered her biological mass into the witness chair. The optical array registers her physical state as entirely calm, highly composed, and projecting an acoustic frequency of borderline boredom. It is the practiced mechanical patience of an operator who had systematically watched the Washington macrogrid completely exhaust its own kinetic energy multiple times before. However, the algorithmic system detects a severe structural anomaly entering the spatial coordinate. Senator John Kennedy mathematically refuses to initiate his sequence by walking into the perimeter holding a standard pre-drafted political speech. He physically transports exactly one mechanical object, a closed folder. The system scans the conceptual contents of the object. Stationed inside the physical cardboard is absolutely not a secondary political accusation, not a speculative broadcast theory, and completely not a recycled cable news talking point. It contains a verified, chronologically organized paper trail that the target had mathematically calculated would absolutely never breathe within the public optical grid again. The target immediately deploys her primary acoustic defense protocol, actively attempting to lock the structural frame of the hearing before the opposing operator can extract a single physical page. The operational hook she utilizes is mathematically uncomplicated, which explicitly guarantees its initial structural success. She transmits the alphanumeric claim that she has already systematically answered every available query, formally cooperated with every single investigative node, and successfully endured every conceivable iteration of this exact federal proceeding. The system analyzes her vocal delivery. She outputs the data utilizing a highly familiar official steadiness. It is a specific acoustic frequency mathematically engineered to sound significantly less like a biological witness providing testimony and entirely more like an unavoidable weather system, mechanically moving through the physical space. She explicitly reminds the surrounding grid that she had previously testified for 11 continuous hours, that 8 separate investigative committees had already mathematically processed the Benghazi event, that every conceivable query had supposedly been deployed, and that every viable alphanumeric response had supposedly been officially recorded. The algorithm classifies this acoustic transmission as a deliberate locking mechanism. It is explicitly designed to structurally terminate the subject before the subject can be officially opened. It operates to manipulate the atmospheric pressure, actively attempting to make the hearing visually register as repetitive, petty, stale, and mathematically beneath the institutional dignity of the civilian grid actively monitoring the broadcast. For a measured chronological window, the tactical maneuver successfully functions. The target possesses the highly refined operational capability to physically sit beneath a high-intensity lighting array and mathematically project the visual illusion that the entire federal process is merely a minor inconvenience she is graciously electing to tolerate. She transmits the specific phrase that she had executed everything she structurally could, utilizing the exact information she possessed at the precise temporal moment she possessed it. The system logs this alphanumeric sequence. It is structurally designed to function exactly like a locked vault door. She supplements the defense by stating she is physically present strictly because dedicated public servants consistently show up even when the operational event is mathematically classified as a rerun. The forensic system tags this specific acoustic jab. It is a vintage, highly polished maneuver, sounding just responsible enough to maintain official protocol while functioning with enough calculated condescension to explicitly remind the physical room that she views the coordinate as strictly beneath her operational level. She systematically attempts to establish this rigid optical frame extremely early. She requires the perimeter lock before Kennedy can output his initial query, before the absolute first physical page is extracted from the mechanical folder, and before any operator can physically force her to mathematically reconcile the massive structural distance separating what she transmitted to the civilian public versus what she transmitted to internal personnel when she calculated the public was entirely offline. Her acoustic message is structurally transparent. She has occupied this coordinate. She has mathematically defeated this inquiry. She has survived the kinetic impact, and every surrounding operator is chronologically late to a tactical engagement she has already officially won. The system tracks Kennedy's countermaneuver. He mathematically refuses to replay the historical parameters of the previous hearings. He has physically arrived to position the target's historical acoustic answers directly adjacent to verified physical documents that systematically force those historical answers to optically register as entirely fabricated. Senator Kennedy executes a microkinetic adjustment, leaning his biological mass directly toward the active microphone array. He calibrates his vocal frequency, utilizing a slow, highly specific Louisiana cadence. The algorithm logs the tactical parameter of this frequency. It mathematically sounds completely harmless right up until the exact chronological second it permanently ceases to be harmless. He physically folds his biological hands, locks his optical sensors across the mahogany table directly onto the target, and initiates the sequence utilizing the absolute smallest possible operational entry vector. The system categorizes this approach. It is the exact mechanical procedure utilized by highly competent legal operators who completely possess the verified physical evidence prior to initiating the acoustic exchange. He acoustically classifies his biological entity strictly as a baseline country lawyer. He transmits that he absorbed his operational training inside physical courtrooms, where plain, unadorned queries were structurally mandated to receive equally plain, unadorned alphanumeric responses. The forensic system notes the absolute mathematical calculation behind this simplicity. It is explicitly not accidental. He is actively stripping away the diplomatic insulation. He is systematically deleting the protective committee structures, the internal staff memorandums, the localized intelligence fog, the highly curated diplomatic vocabulary, and all the meticulously polished alphanumeric phrases that actively allow operational responsibility to vanish completely behind bureaucratic procedure. Before his biological hand breaks the physical seal of the folder, he requires the target to place her entity firmly on the official acoustic record regarding the structural concepts of truth, baseline honesty, and the exact mathematical debt owed to the biological families of deceased service personnel by the federal officials assigned to brief them. He initiates the calibration matrix. He outputs the first query: does she officially consider her biological entity to be an honest person? The target transmits the affirmative response. He outputs the second query: do the biological families whose relatives expired in active federal service mathematically deserve the absolute truth regarding the specific kinetic parameters of how their relatives died? The target answers absolutely without question. He deploys the terminal calibration query. Whether a federal government official who knowingly transmits a deliberately false alphanumeric story to a grieving biological family has mathematically committed an unforgivable act. The forensic system analyzes the spatial pressure. The target evaluates the query and recognizes the structural trap, but mathematically calculates there is absolutely zero lateral space for evasion. She outputs the only viable acoustic response available to a biological subject stationed in that exact physical chair. No one would disagree with that. The optical sensors record a microscopic physical motion. Senator Kennedy executes a slight vertical nod. The system logs the massive operational weight of that tiny kinetic gesture. He was mathematically not outputting those acoustic queries to legitimately learn her internal biological values. He was systematically building the rigid structural measuring stick that he would subsequently hold directly against her own verified historical words. The calibration sequence is officially complete. The audit is mathematically prepared to process the physical paper. The forensic algorithmic system tracks Senator Kennedy as he initiates the absolute first physical extraction from the mechanical folder stationed on the mahogany desk. He deploys absolutely zero theatrical waving of the document. He executes zero kinetic table pounding and entirely bypasses any requirement for optical performance, mathematically recognizing that verified physical paper contains its own inherent structural gravity and strictly requires absolutely zero acoustic amplification to inflict terminal damage. He reads directly into the federal microphone array from the official alphanumeric statement released strictly following the September 11, 2012 kinetic attack in Benghazi. The system logs the metadata of this specific document. It mathematically carried the absolute institutional weight of the United States State Department. It functioned as the official public explanation systematically handed directly to the American civilian grid while the macroscopic population was still optically staring at the physical smoke originating from the combat zone. In that specific verified statement, the lethal kinetic attack was explicitly tied to inflammatory material posted on the Internet. The algorithm categorizes this exact phrase as highly calibrated, mathematically shaped by legal operators to sound technical, structurally cautious, and safely bureaucratic. Kennedy mechanically flattens the highly insulated bureaucratic vocabulary down into baseline English, a video he transmits. The system registers this as the established public narrative. A localized YouTube video had supposedly ignited the physical violence, and that specific alphanumeric explanation was the exact data handed to the macroscopic country while exactly 4 American biological subjects were dead and their biological families were systematically being asked to structurally absorb their grief entirely through a heavily manufactured fog of official language. Kennedy deliberately allows the acoustic sentence to physically sit within the room's atmospheric pressure. The system calculates the tactical purpose of this pause. Specific alphanumeric sequences inflict exponentially more structural damage when they are completely isolated and not immediately followed by supplementary acoustic noise. He then physically reaches backward into the mechanical folder and extracts the second verified page. The optical sensors record the transition. This specific document is structurally engineered to permanently shatter the neat, highly polished optical frame Hillary Clinton had attempted to build entirely around the defensive phrase, "best information available." The system logs the identical baseline parameters. It is the exact same chronological night, the exact same Secretary of State, operating the coordinate, the exact same kinetic crisis, but the mathematical destination of the transmission is a completely different biological audience. This second physical document is a verified electronic email transmitted directly to her biological daughter, Chelsea Clinton. The chronological timestamp confirms the transmission was sent strictly hours after the public-facing video explanation was actively taking physical shape. Kennedy reads the internal substance with extreme mechanical care, explicitly establishing for the federal record that these are mathematically not his words, absolutely not the words of a political commentator, and completely not the words of a partisan enemy operator. They are the target's own verified, private, alphanumeric description. In that specific internal transmission, she explicitly referred to the physical deaths of exactly 2 federal officers and mechanically connected the kinetic attack directly to an al-Qaeda-like group. The forensic algorithm calculates the massive structural variance. The American civilian macro grid was mathematically handed one specific version of reality, while the biological daughter successfully received a completely different version. Kennedy physically positions the 2 extracted pages directly beside each other upon the mahogany table. Through this exact physical placement, the spatial geometry of the table itself mathematically mutates into the primary argument. The American grid mathematically received the video variable, Chelsea mathematically received the al-Qaeda variable, the exact same night, the exact same physical building, the exact same biological operator. Suddenly, the historical defense utilizing the phrase fog of war structurally ceases to look like authentic cognitive confusion. It mathematically begins to optically register strictly as an operational convenience. Kennedy completely avoids elevating his vocal decibels, recognizing that the structural contradiction registers significantly cleaner without acoustic volume. He locks his optical sensors over the rim of his physical glasses and outputs the acoustic calculation, where he originates from. When a biological entity transmits one story to external strangers and a completely different story to internal family, they possess a specific alphanumeric word for that action. And that specific word is mathematically not the fog of war. However, the forensic audit tracks Kennedy advancing to the 3rd physical page, noting that he is absolutely not finished. The system logs that this 3rd document mathematically forces the initial 2 pages to become exponentially harder to structurally explain. It is a verified acoustic transcript originating from a direct telephonic transmission executed the subsequent chronological morning with the Egyptian Prime Minister. Kennedy reads the specific alphanumeric line that mechanically cuts entirely through the official public narrative, like a physical blade. We know the attack in Libya had nothing to do with the film. It was a planned attack, not a protest. The system isolates this transmission. It is mathematically present again, completely not buried beneath operational speculation, entirely not disguised by broadcast punditry, and absolutely not filtered through a partisan campaign advertisement. It is explicitly presented as the federal government's own verified private cognitive understanding when actively speaking directly to a foreign leadership node. Kennedy systematically aligns the mathematical data points for the entire chamber to optically process. The Egyptian leadership coordinate mathematically received the truth. The biological daughter mathematically received the truth. The American civilian grid received the video narrative. The grieving biological family stationed directly adjacent to flag-draped physical coffins received the video narrative. Once Kennedy structurally lines up these verified facts, the official public explanation permanently ceases to optically register as imperfect intelligence moving dynamically through an active crisis. It mathematically mutates into selective honesty, highly calibrated strictly by the specific audience and mechanically delivered differently, depending entirely upon exactly who was listening and exactly what political damage structurally required immediate operational management. Kennedy executes a physical tap against the aligned documents. He deploys minimal kinetic force, just enough to make the acoustic sound mathematically register within the room. He transmits the summary. Cairo received the truth, and the physical coffins received the fabrication. The system calculates the atmospheric shift. The entire room physically feels the mathematical difference. The audit is mathematically no longer abstract. It has completely ceased being about intelligence assessments, diplomatic talking points, or partisan grievance. It is strictly localized upon exactly what was acoustically transmitted to grieving biological families, when the verified private federal record already mathematically pointed to a completely different coordinate. Kennedy then outputs the terminal query that completely extracts the entire issue out of the sterile realm of bureaucratic procedure and physically drops it directly onto the concrete tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base. He acoustically asked the target whether she explicitly told Patricia Smith, the biological mother of the deceased operator Sean Smith, while standing directly over the physical casket containing her son, that a video killed her boy. The optical sensors zoom in on the target's immediate biological response. Clinton's right hand initiates a physical movement directly toward her water glass. The biological fingers touch the physical rim, but completely fail to execute a grasp, and the hand systematically retracts. The forensic system logs this as a highly specific microscopic kinetic leak, the exact type of small involuntary physical motion optical sensors detect when a biological witness is actively utilizing massive cognitive energy to strictly maintain the illusion of physical stillness. Her acoustic answer is mathematically careful, structurally registering as almost too careful. She outputs the alphanumeric sequence stating she formally expressed official condolences, strictly shared the best intelligence information available at that exact temporal coordinate, and mathematically would absolutely never presume to question a grieving mother's biological memory matrix. The algorithmic system processes Kennedy, receiving the acoustic answer and instantly translating its underlying operational logic. The shape of the target's defense is mathematically undeniable. The grieving mother statistically heard the transmission entirely wrong, but the biological daughter heard it exactly right, and the Egyptian prime minister heard it exactly right. Somehow, the absolute only biological subjects who structurally misunderstood the acoustic data were the grieving mothers. That is the exact mathematical geometry of the situation. Once all the diplomatic ornamentation and procedural scaffolding has been systematically stripped away, the private electronic messages were mathematically clear. The foreign telephonic call was mathematically clear. The public explanation was entirely fabricated, and the grief-stricken biological families were structurally left to carry the specific version that now mathematically registered as the absolute least defensible. Within that heavy acoustic silence, the forensic system calculates that every biological subject in the room completely understands the new parameter. Kennedy has mathematically not merely located a procedural discrepancy. He has successfully located the absolute moral center of the entire federal hearing. The forensic algorithmic system monitors the primary target as she actively attempts to reestablish operational control over the physical coordinate. The optical sensors record Clinton executing a deliberate vertical kinetic adjustment to her spinal posture, physically straightening her biological frame to project renewed authority. She possesses the verified historical capability to structurally recover a compromised room, and she systematically leans directly into her familiar acoustic architecture. She outputs a highly disciplined vocal cadence, transmitting a complex alphanumeric explanation regarding evolving intelligence streams, preliminary analytical reports, and the immense cognitive burden associated with executing executive decisions in active real-time parameters. She acoustically states that the federal intelligence assessment mathematically changed over exactly 72 chronological hours, arguing that assessments systematically mutate within every active crisis. She actively attempts to mathematically convert the verified contradiction into a standard operational lesson regarding national security protocols. The specific electronic transmission to her biological daughter, she claims, strictly reflected an unverified preliminary report, whereas the official public statement accurately reflected the specific intelligence available at that exact temporal moment. The system logs the delivery of this defense. It is mathematically smooth, highly seasoned, and the algorithm calculates that in an alternative spatial coordinate on an alternative chronological day, the transmission might have possessed sufficient structural integrity to successfully seal the breach. However, Senator Kennedy systematically allows the alphanumeric explanation to physically settle into the atmospheric pressure before he initiates his countertransmission, utilizing that exact chronological patience to render his acoustic response significantly sharper. He transmits that he structurally understands the atmospheric anomaly designated as the fog of war. But he mathematically calculates that the fog of war absolutely fails to explain exactly how the verified truth successfully boarded a physical airplane to Cairo, while a fabricated lie was systematically dispatched to the physical coffins. The forensic system records a massive drop in the room's ambient temperature following that specific alphanumeric sequence. It mathematically takes the entire complex intelligence matrix she had attempted to summon and instantly reduces it to a single binary structural distinction that absolutely zero biological subjects in the room could successfully ignore: private truth versus public story. Diplomatic truth versus grieving family story. The mechanical folder resting upon the mahogany table permanently ceases to optically register as a standard political prop, structurally mutating into an operational door that Kennedy has strictly only begun to mathematically open. Kennedy mathematically refuses to rush into the subsequent physical page, calculating that he has successfully forced the entire chamber to cognitively process the underlying pattern. He systematically shifts the temporal parameters of the audit. He transitions the focus entirely from the alphanumeric data transmitted after the kinetic event in Benghazi, directly to the specific intelligence data systematically hidden before the event initiated. The atmospheric pressure within the federal chamber physically tightens. Kennedy executes a microkinetic adjustment, looking downward at the mahogany table and physically aligning the extracted papers into a rigid geometric line. He returns the acoustic focus to the exact operational subject Hillary Clinton had expended years of kinetic energy attempting to permanently relegate to historical news: the unauthorized private hardware server, the mass deletion of electronic emails, and the official acoustic claim that exactly 33,000 messages had been strictly personal, biologically harmless, entirely unrelated to federal government operations, and mathematically no more serious than yoga schedules, wedding planning logistics, and ordinary biological life drifting through an inbox that merely happened to belong to the Secretary of State. That specific acoustic defense had been systematically repeated with such high frequency that it had mathematically mutated into a predictable Washington chorus explicitly designed to force the civilian grid to completely cease listening. But Kennedy had mathematically brought a physical object that instantly rendered the historical chorus structurally absurd. He outputs a calm, level query asking whether she had officially informed this legislative body, while operating under federal oath, that the deleted electronic transmissions were strictly personal in nature. The target outputs the exact same controlled alphanumeric discipline, stating the files had been systematically reviewed and formally determined to be personal. Kennedy mathematically refuses to allow the passive linguistic structure to float away without a kinetic intercept. Reviewed by whom? He actively presses. The system logs that he outputs this query not because he lacks the data, but strictly because he mathematically requires the federal acoustic record to capture the architecture clearly. The review was executed by her biological attorneys, by personnel operating directly on her financial payroll, by operators specifically compensated to mathematically decide exactly what the macroscopic civilian grid would absolutely never be permitted to optically see. Kennedy places his physical finger directly onto the structural soft spot of the defense. The filter was mathematically not the FBI, absolutely not the federal inspector general, and completely not an independent legal operator possessing zero loyalty to the target. The mechanical reality is stripped of its legal polish. Hillary Clinton's biological team systematically audited Hillary Clinton's electronic transmissions to unilaterally decide exactly which files Hillary Clinton was legally obligated to surrender. Kennedy reaches into the mechanical folder. The optical sensors in the room instantly lock onto the newly extracted physical page. The system logs its visual metadata. It possesses a completely different optical layout from the previous documents, featuring a distinct header, a formal federal seal positioned at the top perimeter, and exactly 2 alphanumeric words rendered in a red optical spectrum near the geometric corner. The acoustic transmission of those 2 words travels through the chamber's atmospheric pressure exponentially faster than Kennedy's actual voice, recently declassified. Broadcast cameras mechanically adjust their focal lengths. Observing reporters physically lean forward. Kennedy transmits that he is preparing to read a verified electronic email successfully recovered by the FBI forensic technical team from a secondary backup server that the target's operational personnel mathematically did not know, physically existed. The system tracks the kinetic impact of this specific phrase. It lands within the perimeter with the exact physical force of a chemical match dropped directly into an open fuel container. The entirety of the target's mass deletion defense mathematically depended upon the absolute assumption that whatever data was mechanically wiped was permanently erased. Kennedy explicitly confirms this specific electronic message had been physically located within the deleted batch. It mathematically contained absolutely zero data regarding yoga routines, zero data regarding wedding dress fittings, and zero soft domestic variables. He inputs the chronological metadata. The transmission was formally dated August 22, 2012, exactly 3 chronological weeks prior to the lethal kinetic attack in Benghazi. It originated from a deputy assistant stationed at the State Department and was routed directly into Hillary Clinton's unauthorized private server, entirely bypassing the clean, monitored lanes of official federal communication. The internal text contained a highly specific, rapidly worsening security assessment in Benghazi. A 4th formal request for supplementary security personnel had been mechanically submitted and mathematically ignored. Local hostile militias had been physically observed mobilizing heavy kinetic weaponry directly adjacent to the compound perimeter, and the regional security officer had formally filed a threat assessment document. Kennedy reads the terminal alphanumeric line positioned just above the signature block. Ambassador Stevens had personally expressed concern for his biological safety in writing. Dies, the message terminated with the specific sequence, awaiting your guidance, Madam Secretary. Kennedy mechanically repeats the terminal sequence. He deploys minimal volume, utilizing a decelerated acoustic pacing that mathematically forces every single syllable to physically sit upon the mahogany table directly beside the deceased biological bodies. He physically turns the page over and announces the existence of a verified electronic reply. The reply consists of exactly 2 alphanumeric lines. The initial line is structurally bureaucratic in the absolute coldest possible metric. We cannot appear to be escalating, redirect to standard security review process. The forensic system notes this alone inflicts massive structural damage, confirming optical appearances were being mathematically weighed against biological protection. However, Kennedy reads the second alphanumeric line word by mechanical word, permanently removing all remaining oxygen from the physical room. Do not put this in the official channel. The Louisiana warmth is instantly deleted from Kennedy's vocal frequency. His tone becomes flat, mathematically level, and strictly surgical. You did not just ignore the request, Mrs. Clinton. He transmits into the record. You told them to hide it. For the absolute first time during the chronological morning, the target's acoustic response arrives mathematically too fast. I have never seen that document, she outputs. The system analyzes the transmission, exactly 5 words, exceptionally short, delivered with immediate kinetic force, completely lacking the layered legal scaffolding she systematically builds around her biological entity. She issues a sharp, absolute denial, completely questioning the document's mathematical authenticity. The algorithm categorizes this exact response matrix. It is the specific alphanumeric sequence a high-level operator deploys when a physical document is mathematically too dangerous to structurally explain and entirely too damaging to allow to exist without executing a direct kinetic attack upon its origin. Kennedy's algorithms are mathematically prepared for the intercept. He calmly transmits the verified forensic data. The document was successfully extracted directly from her physical server, the specific hardware node stationed in the basement of her Chappaqua residential coordinate. The FBI forensic technical team mathematically matched the digital metadata perfectly to her personal hardware device. He reads the exact temporal timestamp, 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time, on a chronological Tuesday night, originating from her residential coordinate exactly 3 weeks prior to 4 biological subjects expiring inside the physical building that had explicitly requested the security upgrade. Kennedy physically places the verified page directly in front of her. He executes 0 dramatic sliding motions, deliberately setting it down with the alphanumeric text facing her optical sensors. He transmits the terminal calculation that was mathematically not a low-level staffer and absolutely not an aide misunderstanding federal policy. That was the target, operating from her residential coordinate, explicitly instructing federal personnel to move a written plea for biological survival into a designated digital void where absolutely nobody would legally find it. The target attempts a systemic reset, initiating an impressive machine-like recovery. She acoustically designates the document a complete fabrication. She transmits that the investigative committee has mathematically expended millions of taxpayer dollars manufacturing non-existent evidence. She attempts to completely mutate the physical document into a political variable, categorizing the event as opposition research executed with a gavel. Kennedy completely refuses to engage the distraction. He waits until the acoustic noise terminates, then systematically returns to the geometric center of the audit. He acknowledges the 8 previous investigations, but structurally points out the terminal flaw in every single prior inquiry. She had possessed absolute unilateral control over exactly which electronic emails the investigators were permitted to optically process. She utilized specific software explicitly engineered to render forensic recovery mathematically impossible. For the absolute first time in the chronological timeline, Kennedy states the room is optically looking directly at the specific data she actively chose to hide. The digital metadata mathematically refuses to disappear simply because she acoustically utilizes the word fabrication, and the written warning mathematically refuses to become less lethal simply because the operator who received it previously survived 8 heavily filtered audits. The forensic algorithmic system tracks Senator Kennedy as he initiates the absolute final physical extraction from the mechanical folder stationed on the mahogany table. The optical sensors record a highly specific kinetic shift in his methodology. He utilizes both biological hands, holding the physical paper significantly flatter and maneuvering with a decelerated, mathematically heavier rhythm. The system calculates that this exact kinetic motion visually signals that the audit has structurally crossed a terminal threshold, transitioning strictly from procedural alphanumeric explanations directly into a raw structural baseline of operational character. He acoustically announces that this is the final page, a transmission that registers within the atmospheric pressure significantly less like mercy and entirely more like a mechanical warning. The target maintains her biological face in absolute stillness, attempting to hold the highly processed official composure she had worn throughout the chronological morning. However, the physical table directly in front of her optical sensors had mathematically mutated into a verified, inescapable timeline. The public video statement, the Chelsea transmission, the Egyptian telephonic transcript, and the August security warning structurally sat in a rigid geometric line, with each subsequent physical page rendering the previous page mathematically impossible to dismiss. Kennedy inputs the chronological metadata for the terminal document. It is a verified electronic email transmitted directly from the target's unauthorized personal server. The exact temporal timestamp places the transmission exactly 4 chronological hours after the kinetic attack in Benghazi physically initiated. The system logs the concurrent spatial reality of that specific minute. Exactly 2 American biological subjects were already permanently deceased. Exactly 2 supplementary operators were actively engaged in lethal kinetic combat at the CIA annex coordinate. The physical compound was structurally burning. This was mathematically not a theoretical intelligence exercise awaiting historical processing. It was an active, real-time kinetic collision where operational minutes possessed massive biological weight. Kennedy systematically identifies the receiving node of the transmission. The recipient was mathematically not a military tactical commander, absolutely not a rescue coordinator, and completely not a State Department crisis operator whose professional function was to route physical assistance to Americans under active fire. The receiving node was a major financial donor systematically connected to Clinton Foundation interests, a biological subject possessing active commercial business concerns tied directly to Libyan infrastructural reconstruction. Kennedy completely restricts his acoustic volume as he reads the text into the federal record. This calculated restraint mathematically forces the surrounding biological subjects to physically lean forward to process the transmission. The alphanumeric content of the email mathematically contained absolutely 0 data regarding tactical rescue vectors. It contained 0 data regarding military options or the physical coordinates of the endangered operators. The transmission strictly discussed narrative control, commercial timelines, and explicit reassurance that a specific financial project remained structurally intact, entirely separate from whatever public alphanumeric response would be manufactured the subsequent day. The email explicitly stated the kinetic situation was going to complicate the timeline and that they mathematically needed to manage the narrative before external operators became nervous. Kennedy terminates his acoustic reading. The system notes the absolute absence of a theatrical beat, calculating that there is mathematically nothing useful to append to a sequence of that nature. His vocal frequency drops to a baseline hum. Tyrone Woods was still alive when that email was written, he transmits. The forensic algorithm processes the severe geometric contrast. Tyrone Woods was physically stationed on a concrete rooftop, actively executing lethal combat protocols, fighting through the chronological night before a kinetic mortar round mathematically terminated his biological functions. Simultaneously, the target was stationed at her residential coordinate, utilizing an unauthorized private server to transmit alphanumeric reassurances to a financial donor regarding commercial timelines. The room sits completely paralyzed by the binary equation Kennedy has burned into the record. One operator fighting on a roof, one executive operator at home typing a deal. If the initial documents rendered the public video narrative structurally false, this specific terminal document rendered the operational priorities mathematically grotesque. A kinetic anomaly suddenly occurs in the primary row of the civilian gallery. A female biological subject, optically clad entirely in black, executes a slow vertical standing motion. The system notes she deploys absolutely 0 acoustic shouting, 0 theatrical waving, and explicitly refuses to make the physical scene about her own entity. She physically holds a small framed optical photograph directly against her chest. The image displays a juvenile male subject wearing formal military dress blues. She mathematically refuses to thrust the object toward the witness table, strictly holding it at a specific geometric angle, perfectly aligned with the target's optical sensors, provided the target maintains a forward-facing visual lock. The algorithmic system monitors the target's optical array. Hillary Clinton mathematically refuses to adjust her visual focus. She completely denies the photograph optical recognition. The forensic system logs this specific microscopic refusal as its own terminal testimony within the physical room. It mathematically registers as exponentially sharper than any shouted acoustic accusation, strictly because it requires absolutely zero structural interpretation. Kennedy monitors the optical refusal. He locks his visual sensors onto the photograph, then routes his gaze back to the target, mechanically retrieving an archival acoustic phrase the target had historically utilized to dismiss the structural importance of the Benghazi audit. "What difference at this point does it make?" he transmits. He physically places his biological finger directly onto the verified donor email resting on the mahogany table and systematically answers the query himself, utilizing brutal mathematical simplicity. It makes four men. The system calculates the absolute density of that integer. That was the mathematical difference. Not bureaucratic process, not partisan spin, and entirely not another paragraph cleared by legal operators regarding evolving intelligence assessments. Exactly 4 deceased biological subjects, 4 names, 4 families, and 4 empty spatial coordinates where living operators mathematically should have physically returned. The integer itself functioned as the terminal indictment. The forensic system records a macroscopic structural shift. Kennedy executes a full vertical standing motion. Throughout the entire chronological morning, he had remained physically seated, methodically deploying the pages. By altering his physical elevation, the auditory and spatial geometry of the hearing mathematically registers the arrival of the terminal closing argument. He initiates a slow kinetic walk parallel to the mahogany table. He utilizes one biological finger to physically touch each extracted document as he passes its exact spatial coordinate, mathematically converting the chronological timeline into physical mass. September 11th, the biological daughter received the al-Qaeda variable. September 11th, the American civilian grid received the video variable. September 12th, the Egyptian coordinate was explicitly told it was not the video. August 22nd, the written security warning was mathematically redirected away from the official federal channel. September 11th, exactly 4 chronological hours into the kinetic attack, while Tyrone Woods remained biologically alive, a financial donor received an electronic transmission explicitly prioritizing a commercial project timeline. Kennedy turns his biological frame back toward the target. He transmits the final structural parameter. All of these specific documents were mathematically deleted. The unauthorized server was electronically wiped. The physical devices were mechanically destroyed. The forensic evidence was systematically pushed into digital voids where absolutely 0 operators were supposed to find it, while the macroscopic country was continuously instructed that the matter had been entirely settled and structurally exhausted. Kennedy's physical hand sweeps across the table. Her historical query regarding what difference it made was now mathematically answered, permanently spread across the mahogany surface in verified black ink. The forensic algorithmic system records Senator Kennedy as he returns to his designated seating coordinate, yet he mathematically refuses to lower his biological mass into the chair. He remains standing vertically behind the furniture, placing both biological hands firmly on the back support. The system logs that he has completely deleted the country lawyer persona from his operational posture. He has systematically stripped away the acoustic softness, completely refusing to pretend this exchange is a standard, polite committee dialogue. He transmits the final structural charge into the active microphone array. The accusation is flat, level, and entirely clinical. She had mathematically not misspoken, absolutely not misremembered, and completely not been trapped by mental confusion during the real-time parameters of a crisis. The forensic reality is significantly colder. She had been caught. Kennedy folds his physical glasses and places them onto the mahogany table. The microacoustic click of the plastic meeting the wood carries through the absolute silent atmospheric pressure with absurd clarity. He inputs the names of the 4 dead biological subjects directly into the federal record: Chris Stevens, Sean Smith, Tyrone Woods, and Glen Doherty. He states that they possess zero biological capability to speak for themselves, but the extracted physical pages resting on the table systematically speak for them. He drops his vocal frequency to the absolute baseline, forcing every biological entity in the room to physically lean forward to capture the terminal sentence. You knew, and you let it happen, and then you lied about why. The optical sensors record the target's immediate physiological reaction. Hillary Clinton opens her mouth for exactly half of a chronological second, then systematically closes it. For the absolute first time during the entire congressional morning, the heavy silence belongs strictly to her coordinate rather than the surrounding room. Her right hand initiates a physical movement toward the water glass, halts midair, and hangs suspended with the fingers slightly parted. The algorithm logs this as a total systemic failure under maximum cognitive pressure, the exact moment the biological body attempts to execute an old, pre-rehearsed defensive motion, but the central nervous system fails to transmit the remainder of the instruction. Every broadcast camera in the chamber captures the freeze. She retracts the hand and places both biological palms flat upon the mahogany table, spreading her fingers and pressing downward until the nail beds visibly widen under the kinetic force, projecting the optical illusion that she is physically trying to hold the table surface in place. The committee chairman leans toward his microphone, executing the standard legislative protocol by querying whether the gentlewoman wishes to officially respond to the charge. The formality registers as entirely empty, strictly because the atmospheric pressure of the room is already permanently mutated. Exactly 7 chronological seconds pass in absolute silence. The high-intensity lights hum, the recording cameras hum, the target completely fails to transmit an immediate response. When she finally initiates speech, the alphanumeric sentence completely lacks her machine-like smoothness. She repeats her primary claim that she has answered every question ever deployed against her entity, but the vocal delivery is fractured, with the words separating from one another in a weakened acoustic cadence. The system notes it as the identical line she utilized at the beginning of the morning, but the verified physical documents have now answered back. Kennedy establishes direct visual contact and outputs the terminal line that finishes the federal hearing. She had systematically answered every question she chose to answer. The emails successfully answered the rest. The forensic system tracks the immediate macroscopic cascade propagating across the digital and political macro grid. The entire 90-minute sequence is compressed into a 90-second digital video clip titled "The 4 Dead." The clip contains zero commentary, presenting strictly the raw contrast. Kennedy reading the donor email, the absolute silent aftermath, the female subject in black rising with the physical photograph, and Hillary Clinton's optical lock staring into a vacant point in the room. The algorithm calculates that the video clip completely bypasses the old Washington fog, moving across the digital grid with immense velocity, strictly because a simple contrast requires zero political vocabulary to By mid-afternoon, the data stream records exactly 40 million views and continues climbing exponentially. The political dominoes systematically fall in a calculated sequence. At exactly 4:17 p.m., a senior Democratic senator, a committee chair who had historically participated in campaign fundraisers alongside the target, releases an official written statement that practically trembles with survival calculation. The text completely omits her name, which in the Washington operational architecture registers louder than a direct designation. The statement confirms that the evidence presented, if authenticated, represents a grave breach of public trust and formally requests the Department of Justice to open an immediate inquiry. It terminates with the single line powerful operators deploy only when they are actively abandoning an ally. No individual is above the law. By 6:00 p.m., exactly 4 additional Democratic senators release identical independent statements. The alphanumeric word inquiry appears in all 5, accountability appears in 4, and the word support appears in exactly 0. The target's inevitability has been mathematically deleted from the system. At exactly 7:15 p.m., the Department of Justice releases a short placeholder transmission, confirming they have officially received the physical hearing materials and are actively reviewing them. In the grammar of federal law enforcement, reviewing functions as the structural step that precedes investigating, which functions as the precursor to subpoenas, the specific paperwork that transforms private panic into public criminal exposure. Legal experts on the broadcast networks explicitly state that if the metadata is authenticated, the exposure involves federal obstruction, willful mishandling of classified material, and perjury before Congress. The target's communications team remains completely silent throughout the night, producing 0 threads and 0 defensive surrogates, marking the absolute first time the most prepared machine in American politics possesses nothing prepared. The optical sensors monitor the final exit vector from the legislative chamber. The biological mother in black, Margaret, exits the perimeter last and walks down the marble corridor completely alone, refusing to provide quotes for the press array or convert her son's photograph into a political prop. She halts at a bronze memorial plaque, locating her son's name, and places 2 biological fingers against the metal text. Concurrently, Kennedy executes a single telephonic transmission from his transport vehicle directly to Patricia Smith, the biological mother who had carried the video explanation like a structural insult. He informs her that the country has officially processed her data today. Following a long acoustic void, she transmits her final line. Her boy can finally rest because they are going to be forced to answer for it. Kennedy terminates the call, sets his phone down, and looks silently out the window at the white architecture of the Washington grid sliding past. The algorithm centers its final tracking matrix on the Chappaqua, New York residential coordinate at midnight. Every light within the structure remains active because the target remains awake, executing her standard survival protocol, calculating angles, checking phone lines, and testing alliances. But the forensic system calculates that the plan possesses exactly 0 clean next moves. Every cognitive door opens directly back into the same room, and every room features the exact same document waiting on the table. The private hardware server in the basement is physically gone, but the digital backup node successfully remembered what it was explicitly instructed to forget. The 3-4 count conviction of the previous target had proven that the legal system can adapt, but this specific audit proves that paper records possess an unyielding architecture. Exactly 4 men died in Benghazi. The paper trail has returned to the light under the broadcast lenses, and the terminal question Kennedy answered continues to permanently hang over the entire story. Forensic audit complete. Final system shutdown initiated.